The internet fundamentally changes how people communicate. Most importantly, in its most celebrated aspects, the internet democratizes speech. It provides a cheap way for people to communicate to potentially unlimited audiences. In the mass media or broadcast eras, if you wanted to reach a large audience, you had to rely on an intermediary publisher. The publishers of newspapers, of magazines, of books, or the broadcasters of film, radio, and television. These were the gatekeepers of speech in the mass media and broadcast age. The promise that the internet brings is to decentralize speech, to enable ordinary people like you and I to reach potentially billions of people with access to relatively cheap consumer hardware and consumer internet connections. So this is amazing. It's a really big part of what makes the internet great. Anyone can be a publisher on the internet. Of course, there are new gatekeepers. There are the search engines and the operators of social networks and the other platforms that direct users to the content that they want to access. But the fundamental principle, the promise of the internet, is that it provides a way for a greater range of people to be heard. Now that's something to be celebrated. About 10 years ago, Time magazine released their 2006 Person of the Year. And it was us, you, the creator of speech. This is tapping into the heady times of the Web 2.0 era, as we really started to understand the potential benefits of what we might call user-generated content, where sites like YouTube and other media sharing sites were arising that enabled us to create easily entertainment and information resources that could reach the world. This is the rise of citizen journalism, of amateur media. And it's a fantastically celebrated rise. Clay Shirky's book is called Here Comes Everybody. And it taps into this idea, this potential, that the internet provides an amazing opportunity for the decentralization and the democratization of speech. This phenomenon is often seen as a revolution in democracy itself, often billed as removing the power of centralized gatekeepers to control the political and social discourse. Conceivably then, the potential of the internet is really to democratize speech, to democratize the ability to make meaning in our culture, to put the power in the hands of the ordinary people to create and recreate our shared culture. At the same time, though, the decentralization of speech makes legitimate democratic regulation much more difficult. The internet is much harder to regulate than mass media or broadcast media because it is decentralized in nature. In a broadcast era, there were relatively few targets of regulation. The broadcasters could have standards imposed upon them that would act to regulate the types of content that are available to people to consume in society. Regulating speech in the internet era is much more complicated, and it requires a new way of thinking about it. Now, on the internet, when everyone can be a publisher, there is so much more material for people to keep up with. The fact is, we now have billions of connected users transmitting a huge, unfathomable amount of information every day over decentralized networks that don't have any easy points of regulatory control. The fact that these networks are global, that they connect people that are for all intents and purposes anonymous, means that it is very difficult to regulate the actual publishers in the internet era, the individuals who are making content available. This is a challenge for democracy. If we believe that governments have a right to create democratic rules that govern how their citizens interact and access information, then this poses a challenge for regulators to actually be able to put those laws into practice, to enforce our civil and criminal laws. So a large part of the challenge of online regulation is finding a way to target the new intermediaries, the new gatekeepers of the online era. Finding a way to impose obligations on the search engines, the social media networks and the platforms that provide users with a way to reach their large audiences, that provide a way for audiences to discover the information that they want to look for. One way of doing this is by imposing liability on the new gatekeepers, by making those new gatekeepers directly responsible for the actions of their users. We can create an obligation to monitor, police, and enforce the law on those decentralized entities. This means, for example, that we might hold search engines or the providers of social networks liable for defamatory or criminal or other harmful content that is on their networks or that is made accessible via their networks. This is really the only way in which governments can have an effective and scalable way of regulating the internet. These intermediaries provide the focal points of regulation. They are the large gatekeepers that we can leverage to have some effect on the billions of users on the internet. The problem is, these intermediaries are also the ones who are responsible for bringing us the amazing content that's on the internet. And they want certainty. They want an ability to provide their services without having to fear the liability that comes from content that they are not in control of. Unlike a mass media publisher that has an editor that reviews content, or unlike a broadcaster that takes responsibility for the content that it puts out. The new intermediaries, the Googles, YouTubes, Facebooks, and so on, these intermediaries have so much content traveling over their network that they can't afford to vet everything in advance. So they are very reluctant to take on any potential responsibility for the content that flows over their networks. And in some jurisdictions, most notably in the United States, they are shielded by a quite strong safe harbor from any potential liability from the speech of others. So the law, in setting these obligations, needs to be really careful in achieving an optimal social balance between, on the one hand, the desire that governments have to create enforceable laws. This is the efficiency argument, that by imposing obligations on these centralized intermediaries, we achieve regulatory goals at the lowest social cost. These are, in economic terms, the least cost avoiders. They are the cheapest way of regulating speech. But on the other hand, we need to balance the interests of freedom of speech of individuals, freedom of access to information of users that are being regulated on these networks. We need to address their concerns for due process and legitimate governance. And we also need to worry about the intermediaries. We need to make sure that we are creating an environment where people can deliver new, innovative services. The magical growth of the internet over the last 20 years has been largely due to investments by private firms in creating new ways for people to connect. And that zone of freedom that they have, the ability to operate free from liability for the content that others produce, is fundamentally important to creating the innovative spaces that we see online and that we enjoy and have come to rely on every day. So the law needs to take into account these three distinct set of interests. First, the interests of society in having an efficient and effective way to enforce our civil and criminal laws. Second, the interest of intermediaries in being free from liability for content that they are not responsible for producing and have no editorial control over. And third, the interests of users who want to be able to access information and they want to be able to speak. We need to protect the democratic potential of the internet to enable users to be able to impart and seek information. This is a really difficult balance that makes intermediary liability law an incredibly complex and contested area. These interests are all at times conflicting, and it makes it really difficult for governments to articulate a set of regimes that are able to satisfy all stakeholders. Different jurisdictions have come to different understandings of the appropriate balance between these different interest groups. The United States, for example, has a very strong safe harbor in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that absolves intermediary service providers from potential liability for communications that they do not produce. This means that there's a lot of certainty for the operators of social networks and search engines and other online intermediaries that operate out of the United States. And it's why we see a phenomenon that we call regulatory arbitrage, which means that the technological innovators that rely on that safe harbor tend to move to jurisdictions that support them. And that's why a lot of the large social networks that grew up out of the United States have remained incorporated in the United States, because there is a legal regime that protects their legal interests. In Australia, by contrast, our intermediary liability laws are not so clear-cut. We hold intermediaries strictly liable for defamatory content posted by their users, once they become aware of the nature of that content. Also, unlike the United States, we don't have strong safe harbors for people who provide internet services that might be used to facilitate copyright infringement. So, for example, content hosts like Facebook or search engines like Google, they are reluctant to operate their actual servers in Australia because they could be liable in Australia for the content that people post on their servers if they're not quick enough to remove it. When they're in the United States, or subject to United States jurisdiction, they can rely on the safe harbors that form part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to respond and take reasonable steps to respond and remove content that appears to be infringing when they are notified by notices in a specified form. In Australia, while we have safe harbors, they only apply to internet service providers. They don't apply to the other providers of internet services like the content hosts and search engines, Facebook and Google. This leads to some interesting submissions by these companies who say that they couldn't possibly operate within Australia. This is not to say that this is the only reason we don't have homegrown services like Google coming out of Australia. But it is a contributing factor to a sense of uncertainty that really worries the telecommunication industry about whether they can provide new services under the protection of Australian law. In short, as we're going to see, Australian intermediary liability law is a bit of a mess. It's a bit of a mishmash of different doctrines and different safe harbors and protections and some common law protections thrown in. There's no clear, easy answer of when an intermediary will be liable for the content produced by end users or third parties. This makes it a little bit uncertain for people who are providing hosting or indexing services in Australia, but it also makes it quite difficult for the people who want to be able to exercise some control over content to know how they can actually do that, or whether they can actually do that. We don't have any streamlined set of procedures for how intermediaries must respond to notice and takedown requests, for example. This means, on the whole, that the current Australian law is not doing a great job either of providing the certainty that innovators need, or providing an efficient way of enforcing our civil and criminal laws. And it's certainly not providing certainty on protection to the democratic interests of users who want to be able to speak and be heard online.